The morning Delia Lockhart rode into the Caldwell stockyards looking for work. There were 14 men ahead of her in line, and not a single one of them believed she would last past sundown. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle drives out of Kansas were still the lifeblood of the frontier economy. Long trails pushing north from Texas up through Indian Territory and into the railheads where beef was worth more than gold if you could get it there alive. The Kishom Trail had been carved by 1,000 hooves before hers, and it would see 1,000 more, but Delia Lockhart had not ridden 3 days alone across open Kansas to be turned away by a man who had never seen a woman rope a longhorn. She was 24 years old, not soft, not fragile, not the kind of woman who waited on porches with embroidery in her lap. She had grown up on her father's cattle operation south of Abilene, had learned to ride before she could properly read, had mended fences in blizzards and nursed sick calves through fever, and helped her father birth difficult calves on frozen ground in the January dark. Her father, Henry Lockhart, had died the previous winter of a lung sickness that came on fast and left faster, and when the bank foreclosed on the small spread he had built over 20 years, Delia had packed what she could carry on a single horse and pointed herself toward the only work she knew. She had broad shoulders for a woman and rope-calloused hands and dark brown hair she kept braided and tucked under a battered felt hat that had once belonged to her father. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that changed depending on the light, and her jaw had a stubborn set to it that men often mistook for pride before they learned it was simply determination. She did not walk into the stockyards trying to impress anyone. She walked in because she needed work, and this was the only work she was qualified for. The trail boss running the hiring that morning was a man named Virgil Tuck, short and barrel-chested with a gray mustache that covered most of his upper lip and a habit of squinting at people longer than was comfortable. He had been running cattle up from Texas for 15 years, and he had opinions about most things in the world, and most of those opinions were wrong in ways he would never discover. He looked at Delia the way most men looked at her in those moments, which was with a kind of baffled amusement that had a hard edge underneath it. "This is a cattle drive, miss," he said, "not a sewing circle." The men in line behind her laughed. A couple of them shifted, finding this the most interesting thing to happen yet that morning. Delia did not flinch. "I can see that," she said. "I am looking to hire on as a hand. I have been working cattle since I was 7 years old. I can rope, I can ride cutting horses, I can night herd, I can read weather, and I can cook in a pinch if your chuck man gets hurt. I am not asking for special consideration. I am asking for the same chance you would give any man standing in that line." Virgil Tuck squinted harder. He looked at her hands. He looked at her horse, a solid buckskin quarter horse with good legs and a calm eye, well-maintained and clearly well-trained. He looked at the rope coiled at her saddle horn, the kind of wear on it that comes from actual use rather than show. "I got 14 men ahead of you," he said. "I will wait," she said. She did wait. She stood at the end of that line in the Kansas morning sun for 2 full hours while Virgil Tuck hired 10 of the 14 men ahead of her and turned away 4. And when she finally stood before him again, he seemed almost surprised she was still there. "You are still here," he said. "I said I would wait." He studied her for another long moment, and then he said something she did not expect. "Can you prove it? The roping?" There was a small holding pen nearby with a few steers waiting for sorting. Delia took her rope from her saddle horn, built her loop with 2 easy swings, and dropped it clean around the neck of a steer that had been moving at a trot. She dallied fast, the buckskin planting itself without being told, and the steer came up short and stood looking put out about the whole business. Virgil Tuck pulled at his mustache. Then he said, "$1 a day, same as the others, you sleep separate, you pull the same shifts. Nobody is going to carry your weight because you are a woman, and if they try to, you stop them. Are we clear?" "Clear," said Delia. "One more thing," Virgil said, and his voice dropped a register. "Some of these men are not going to like it. You are going to hear things. If a man puts a hand on you, I will fire him on the spot, but the words and the looks, that is something you are going to have to weather on your own. I cannot manage what is inside a man's head. I have been weathering that since I was old enough to know what I wanted to do, Delia said. I am used to it. And so she was hired. The drive was a big one. 500 head of longhorn cattle belonging to a ranching operation out of South Texas, bound for the railhead at Caldwell with plans to push on from there if the prices were not right. There were 16 hands total including Delia, plus Virgil Tuck himself, and an old Mexican cook named Senor Ramirez who drove the chuck wagon with the kind of philosophical calm that comes from having seen everything twice. The cattle were mixed quality, some good blocky animals and some rangy, nervous beasts that would challenge the night-herd riders from the start. And then there was Clark Hawkins. He was already with the outfit when Delia joined it, hired 2 days prior, and she noticed him the way she noticed most things, with a practical, assessing eye before she allowed herself to notice anything personal. He was 28 years old, tall in the way that useful men tend to be tall, with the kind of lean, rope-muscled build that comes from hard work rather than vanity. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, sun-browned skin, and a way of moving around livestock that Delia recognized immediately as the movement of someone who had been doing this long enough that it had become a second language rather than a learned skill. He wore his hat pushed back on his head when he was thinking and down over his brow when he was working, and he had a scar along his jaw from some old injury he never explained. He was from Colorado originally, she would learn later, had spent several years working ranches in New Mexico territory, and had come east for reasons he kept to himself. He was quiet in the way of a man who had learned that most things worth saying could be said in fewer words than people generally used, and he had a reputation among the other hands as someone who was absolutely reliable in a crisis and absolutely impossible to rattle. The first time they spoke was on the second day of the drive, when a young steer broke from the herd and Delia and Clark both went after it at the same moment. They rode at angles, reading each other's direction without speaking, and between them they turned the animal and pushed it back into the herd in a piece of work that was, for those few minutes, nearly elegant. When it was done they pulled up alongside each other, breathing hard, their horses blowing. "Good read," Clark said. He was looking at where the steer had rejoined the herd, not at her. "Likewise," said Delia. That was the whole of it. He tipped his hat brim forward and rode back to his position on the left flank. Delia rode back to her position on the right. But something had passed between them in those few minutes that she turned over in her mind later when the night was quiet and the cattle were settled, and she was wrapped in her bedroll at the edge of camp, listening to the low hum of whoever had the night herd shift singing to keep the longhorns calm. The other hands were not all equal in their reception of her. There was a man named Dix Colby, heavyset and red-faced, who had taken an immediate dislike to her presence that seemed to go beyond simple prejudice and into something more specific and angry. He made comments at meals, not directed at her exactly, but clearly meant for her hearing, about women who did not know their place and what kind of woman signs on to a cattle drive and what kind of outfit hires one. He had a friend named Arnie Pell who laughed at everything Dix said and added nothing original to any conversation. There were others who were neutral, watching to see what she would do before they made up their minds. A young hand named Pete Sorrows who was maybe 19 and clearly had never been around a woman who worked cattle, so he overcorrected into a kind of frantic helpfulness that was exhausting. There were a couple of veterans who simply did not care one way or the other as long as she did her job, which she appreciated more than any of the other responses. And then there was the simple grinding work of it, which Delia had known would be hard, and which proved harder than she had remembered, or perhaps she had simply not been doing it at this scale before. 500 longhorns on the move require constant management. The herds string out into a long moving line, points at the front, Swing riders further back, flank riders on the sides, and drag at the rear where the dust is thickest and the weakest, slowest animals walk. Virgil had put Delia at drag for the first week, which was either a test or a punishment or both. Drag was the worst position. The dust came up in walls. By the end of a day at drag, you could not tell where the dust ended and your skin began. You breathed grit and tasted grit, and the cattle that fell to the back of the herd were invariably the ones who needed the most managing, the lame ones, the tired ones, the young ones not sure of themselves yet. You pushed and you pushed and you kept pushing, and if you showed weakness, the animals behind would fall further and further, and eventually you would have stragglers a half-mile behind the main herd, which Virgil Tuck would not tolerate. Delia did not ask to be moved from drag. She worked it the same way she had worked everything else in her life, by refusing to look at the whole length of it and instead keeping her eyes on the next hour, the next mile, the next animal that needed turning. She learned which of the drag cattle were prone to falling behind, and she learned their habits, and she learned to anticipate their moves before they made them. By the end of the first week, she was holding the drag tighter than some of the men who had worked that position for years. Clark Hawkins worked the right swing position, one spot forward from drag in the herd hierarchy, and from that position he occasionally had a view of the drag and what was happening there. She did not know he was watching, not at first. She was too busy working to think much about being watched. The first real crisis of the drive came on the 12th day out, when a violent prairie thunderstorm came up from the southwest with almost no warning, the sky going from clear afternoon blue to greenish black in what felt like 30 minutes. Virgil Tuck had camped them in a draw that turned out to be a mistake, good shelter from the wind, but a natural funnel for water if the storm was serious. And the storm was serious. The cattle knew it before the men did, that particular unease that moves through a herd like a current, tails switching, heads coming up, the general drift toward panic that every drover learns to read. Delia was coming off what should have been her rest period, barely an hour into it, when she heard the change in the herd and sat up in her bedroll and looked at the sky and started pulling on her boots before anyone had called for all hands. The storm hit with the kind of violence that the southern plains produce in late spring, lightning striking close enough to turn the darkness white and thunder that seemed less like sound and more like a physical blow. The cattle broke, not all at once but in waves, the panic spreading from the south edge where the lightning was striking and rolling through the herd until 500 animals were running in the dark. A cattle stampede at night is one of the most dangerous things on a trail drive. The ground cannot be seen clearly, the direction of the run changes unpredictably, and the animals are beyond reason, driven purely by fear. Men have died being thrown from horses and trampled, have died riding into unseen ravines, have died simply from the terrible physics of being between a large animal and where it has decided to go. Delia rode into that chaos on her buckskin, who proved in that moment to be worth every cent she had paid for him. A horse with the steadiness to respond to her leg and hand, even when every instinct he had told him to run with the cattle rather than against them. She found a group of 20 or so animals that had split from the main run and were heading toward a rocky incline that would have broken legs wholesale. And she pushed the buckskin to a dead run in the dark and came around the head of that group and turned them back, shouting and waving her hat, the horse reading her intention and giving her everything he had. She worked for 2 hours in that storm, soaked through and covered in mud, riding angles in the dark by feel and instinct and the intermittent illumination of lightning. She did not think about being afraid. She thought about each animal, each gap in the herd, each direction that needed closing. When the lightning finally moved east and the rain slowed from a torrent to a steady fall, and the cattle began to blow themselves out and mill into the loose, exhausted circle that means the run is finished, she counted herself alive and reasonably intact, and felt a bone-deep satisfaction that she recognized as the feeling she lived for. In the dark and the rain and the mud it was hard to see who had done what. Virgil Tuck was doing his accounting, riding the perimeter of the scattered herd with a lantern, calling names and getting answers. They had lost 11 head that would need to be found in daylight, 3 of which had likely gone into a gully that nobody was going in after in the dark. One man had been thrown from his horse and had a broken arm, a hand named Morrison who would need to be sent back to the nearest settlement in the chuck wagon. 2 horses had minor injuries. Nobody had died, which Virgil said with the particular relief of a man who had not always been this lucky. At the fire, when what remained of the night was being sorted out, there was talk among the men, the compressed, emphatic talk of people who have just been frightened and have come through it. They talked about who had done what in the run, and Delia sat at the edge of the firelight with her coffee and her wet clothes and listened to the names that got said. Dix Colby had turned a group of steers that would have scattered further. Pete Sorrows had ridden hard and done good work for a young hand. Clark Hawkins had apparently done something extraordinary on the north end of the run, gotten ahead of the main body and turned them before they reached the rocky ground where real losses would have occurred, and the men spoke of it with genuine admiration. Nobody said Delia's name. She had turned 20 animals away from that incline in the south. She had ridden 2 hours in the dark and the rain and the mud. Nobody said her name. She did not show anything. She had known this was possible, probable even, and she poured herself another cup of Senor Ramiers's bitter, excellent coffee and sat in her wet clothes and watched the fire and told herself it did not matter. The work mattered, and the cattle were mostly found and nobody had died, and that was sufficient. Then Clark Hawkins spoke. He had been sitting on the other side of the fire, and she had not been looking at him, and his voice came out of that general low conversation, the way a bell comes out of distance, clear and carrying. "I need to say something," he said, and the particular quality of his voice was such that the conversation dropped away and people looked at him. "I have been on a lot of drives. I have seen some good night work in a stampede. What Delia Lockhart did tonight in the south end of this herd was the best riding I have seen from anyone in a run like this. She turned 20 head away from that rocky incline by herself in the dark in that rain. I saw it. I want it known." The fire crackled. The cattle shuffled in the dark beyond the light. Someone poured coffee somewhere. He had not said it quietly. He had said it in the clear, carrying voice of a man who intended to be heard, who had decided something was true, and had decided equally that truth needed to be spoken, and he had said her name. Delia Lockhart. Not the woman, not she, her name. Delia looked across the fire at him, and he was looking back at her, steady, with no particular expression beyond the simple sincerity of what he had just done. There was nothing performative about it. He had seen something real and he had said so in front of everyone. And now, he picked up his coffee cup again, and the conversation restarted around the fire as though the moment had closed itself neatly. But the moment had not closed for Delia. It had opened something, quietly, like a door that had been closed so long she had almost forgotten it was there. Dix Colby muttered something to Arnie Pell that she could not quite catch. Several of the other men nodded, acknowledging it, and Pete Sorrows looked at her with an expression that had something in it she recognized as the beginning of genuine respect, rather than the flustered helpfulness from before. Virgil Tuck said nothing, but he was watching Clark Hawkins with an expression that was impossible to read. The next morning, after a few hours of thin sleep, the drive resumed the business of gathering the scattered stock and getting back on the trail. Morrison was loaded into the chuck wagon with his broken arm splinted by Senor Ramiers, who had some medical knowledge of a practical frontier variety, and he would be dropped at the nearest town, a small settlement called Garner's Crossing, on their way past. Delia was at the buckskin side, checking the horse over after the previous night's hard riding, when Clark Hawkins walked up. He stood at a comfortable distance, the kind of distance that is not crowding and not coldness either, and looked at the horse's legs along with her. "He is a good horse," Clark said. "He is the best horse I have ever ridden," Delia said. "His name is Reed, after the plant or after a person." "After my father, his middle name." She had not intended to say that, and she was not sure why she had. Clark nodded as though this made complete sense. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I should have said it faster last night. By the time I realized nobody was going to say it, the conversation had moved on and I had to bring it back. I am sorry it took that long." Delia straightened from the horse's leg and looked at him directly. "You did not have to say it at all," she said. "Most men would not have. Most men would have been wrong not to," he said simply. There was nothing in his manner that suggested he was trying to impress her or make himself the hero of the story he had just told. He was simply a man who had a clear idea of what was right and had acted on it, and he seemed no more interested in being praised for it than she was interested in praising him. This, she found, was deeply attractive to her, more than any physical quality, the simple, reliable architecture of a man who knew what he believed and stood in it. "Clark Hawkins," she said. "Yes." "Thank you," she said. He tipped his hat in a small, genuine gesture and walked back to his horse. Over the following weeks, the drive settled into the specific rhythm of a long trail, the daily grinding miles, the river crossings, the constant management of the herd's needs and moods, the meals at the chuck wagon that were always the same and always desperately welcome. They crossed the Cimarron, which was running high from the spring rains and required a long, tense crossing where the cattle had to be kept moving to prevent them from turning back. And 2 days later, they crossed the Salt Fork of the Arkansas, which was lower and easier. Delia and Clark began to find themselves riding side by side during the day with increasing frequency, not by design exactly, but by the natural drift of two people whose working rhythms matched. He had moved her from drag to the right swing after a conversation with Virgil Tuck that Delia was not party to, and she did not ask about it, but the change meant they now worked adjacent positions for most of the day. They talked about cattle. They talked about horses. They talked about the land, which was a particular kind of country out here, grassland that went to the horizon in every direction with a sky so large it had weight. "Where are you from?" asked her one afternoon when the herd was walking calmly and there was space for conversation. "South of Abilene," she said. "My father had a spread there. He died last winter." "I am sorry," he said, and he said it the way people say things when they mean them without the rote quality of obligation. "It was his lungs," she said. "He was sick for a while and then he was gone quickly. The bank took the place afterward. There was not much left." She paused. "What about you?" "Colorado mostly," he said. "My family had a place there. I have been drifting since my brother died." She did not ask how the brother had died. She could tell from the way he said it that it was a closed door, and she respected that. She knew about closed doors. "Do you want to stop drifting eventually?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the herd ahead of them. "I think so," he said. "I think I am getting closer to knowing what I want to stop drifting for." She did not ask him what he meant by that. She thought she might know, and the thought was something she turned carefully in her hands, like a piece of glass in sunlight, trying to understand what she was looking at. The days accumulated. The landscape changed as they moved, the grassland giving way to scrub and then to grassland again, the sky always enormous, the nights cold still even as the days warmed into real spring. Senor Ramires fed them beans and salt pork and cornbread and occasional fried beef when an animal died of natural causes, and his coffee was strong enough to stand on its own without a cup, and he played a guitar in the evenings with a lightness that seemed to remake the long day into something bearable and sometimes beautiful. Delia noticed things about Clark that she had not meant to notice. The way he talked to his horse, a big gray gelding named Soldier, with a running quiet commentary that the horse seemed to appreciate even if it did not understand. The way he helped Pete's sorrows without making the younger man feel helped, which was a specific social skill that Delia admired. The way he ate with his hat off, which was a courtesy she had noticed because most of the other men did not bother. The way he laughed, which was not frequent but was complete, A full, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise him slightly each time, as though he had not expected to find something funny and found it a pleasant surprise. She noticed, too, that Dix Colby had not stopped his low-level campaign of antagonism. He never did anything that could be called out directly, never put a hand on her or made a threat explicit enough to bring to Virgil. He simply created a kind of constant atmosphere of dismissal and contempt, small comments, theatrical sighs when she spoke at the fire, the occasional ostentatious looking away when she contributed anything to a discussion. It was the kind of thing that is hard to fight because it is hard to name, and she knew it, and she endured it, and she was angry about it in a specific cold way that she kept private. Clark was aware of it too. She could tell from the way he occasionally placed himself between her and Dix's commentary without appearing to, shifting his position at the fire or redirecting a conversation with the smooth, natural skill of someone who has dealt with difficult situations before. He never made it about protecting her, which would have been condescending. He made it about Dix Colby being tiresome and unworthy of the group's attention, which was both accurate and effective. One evening, about 3 weeks into the drive, they were camped near a small tributary creek, and most of the men had settled for the night. Delia was oiling her rope and Clark was nearby cleaning his saddle, and they were alone in the way that people are alone when everyone else is asleep and the fire is low. The night-herd man was singing somewhere out in the dark, a slow hymn that carried on the cool air. "Can I ask you something?" Clark said. "You can ask," she said. "Why this? I mean, I know why anyone does this work, but for you specifically, knowing how it is going to be, why not find something else?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "What else would I do?" she said. "I could cook in a town, I could sew for people, I could work in a hotel or a dry goods store, I could try to find a husband." She looked at the rope in her hands. "This is what I know, this is what I am good at. I am not going to give up the thing I am good at because it makes some men uncomfortable. That seems like a very bad trade." "It is a very bad trade," he agreed. "My father raised me to do this work," she said. "He never once told me that it was not for me because I was a girl. He said the cattle do not care and the land does not care, and the only people who care are the people making a choice to, and that is their problem, not mine." She paused. "I miss him very much." "He sounds like a remarkable man," Clark said. "He was ordinary in most ways," she said, "but he was right about that." She looked at him sidelong. "What made you say something that night, after the stampede? You did not have to." Clark set down his cleaning cloth and looked at the low fire. "My mother," he said after a moment, in a tone that suggested he was selecting words carefully. "She worked twice as hard as any man on our ranch, and she was never acknowledged for it, not by my father, not by anyone who came through. She just did the work and nobody said so. I was a kid and I could see it and I did not know what to do about it, and I grew up knowing that I had missed chances to do what was right, and I was not going to keep missing them." Delia looked at him for a long moment. The fire shifted between them. The hymn from the night herd came and went on the wind. "That is an honest answer," she said. "I am generally an honest man," he said. "I know," she said. "I noticed." Something happened in the air between them in that quiet sentence, a small shift like pressure changing before a change in weather, and they both felt it and neither of them said anything about it, and the silence that followed was full rather than empty. The next morning they crossed into a stretch of country that was rougher, more broken, the flat grassland giving way to low hills and scrub oak and red cedar, and the cattle were difficult through it, the herd wanting to break into small groups and graze the brush rather than push north. It required constant riding, constant pressure, and it was in this rough country that Dix Colby made his one direct move. He came up beside Delia in the brush when they were away from the main group, both of them pushing a cluster of steer back toward the herd, and when the cattle were moving, he pulled his horse across her path and stopped her. "You have had your run," he said. His face was its usual red, but there was something else in it now, a cornered quality she did not like. "You are making the rest of us look bad with all your proving yourself. Tuck is watching you instead of managing the drive proper. You need to think about whether this is the right situation for someone like you." Delia sat her horse and looked at him without blinking. "Are you telling me to quit?" she said. "I am telling you that some situations are not meant for some people," he said. "And the smart person sees that before the situation makes them see it." "Is that a threat, Mr. Colby?" she said. "It is just wisdom," he said, and he smiled in a way that made her skin crawl. "I will tell you something," Delia said, keeping her voice entirely level. "I have been working this herd for 3 weeks and I have not asked for a single accommodation on account of my being a woman. I have pulled every shift, ridden every crisis, and done my job as good or better than every man in this outfit. If you have a problem with that, that is your problem. And if you ever pull your horse across my path again with anything like a threat in your voice, I will go directly to Virgil Tuck and I will tell him exactly what was said and let him decide how to manage the situation. Are we clear?" Dix Colby looked at her for a long, ugly moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the herd without another word. That evening she told Clark about it, not because she needed help but because she thought he should know. He listened to the whole account without interrupting, his face still and attentive. "What do you want me to do with that?" he asked when she finished. She liked that he asked. "Nothing yet," she said. "I handled it, but I wanted someone to know it happened." "I know it happened," he said. "I will keep my eyes open." "Do not fight my battles," she said immediately. "I am not going to fight your battles," he said, "but I can have eyes and use them. That is not a battle." She considered this. "Fair enough," she said. He was watching her with that steady quality he had, the quality that did not demand anything or perform anything, that simply looked and paid attention. She thought suddenly, and without meaning to, that she would like very much to be looked at like that for a long time, and the thought startled her enough that she looked away toward the dark horizon where the cattle were moving. "Delia," he said. She turned back. It was the first time he had used only her first name, not her full name, and the difference was small and significant. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to say it." Her heart did something she was not prepared for. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Good night, Clark." "Good night," he said. They did not talk about what had not been said. The work continued and the trail continued, and the miles accumulated under the hooves of 500 longhorns pushing north through the spring Kansas country. The drive had been on the trail for 5 weeks when they hit a section of the route that had been cut up by recent traffic, ruts deep enough to be treacherous, and Virgil Tuck decided to push west a few miles to find better ground, which added 2 days to their route but saved the horses' legs. In those extra 2 days the weather turned again, this time not a violent storm but a gray, cold, persistent rain that made everything wet and miserable, and turned the trail to mud, and the men's tempers to something short and rough-edged. In miserable weather the small truths of a person's character come out. Some men collapse into complaint and do the minimum. Some men find their worst selves in the cold and the wet and take it out on those around them. Clark Hawkins, Delia observed, simply worked. He did not complain. He did not make the rain anyone else's problem. He moved through the gray, miserable days with the same steady efficiency he brought to every other condition, and occasionally he had a quiet word of encouragement for Pete Sorrows when the younger man was visibly struggling, and he made sure his horse was properly cared for before he took anything for himself. Delia was the same. She had learned long ago that a long stretch of misery was best managed by making herself very small inside it, focusing only on the next task, and she moved through the 2 days of rain with her head down and her hands busy and her mind on the cattle and not on the discomfort. On the evening of the second rain day, sheltered as much as possible under the chuck wagon's extended canvas, she and Clark ended up side by side with their coffee, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, because the dry space under the canvas was limited and everyone was crowded into it. She was aware of him with a physical specificity she had been trying not to be aware of, the warmth that came off him in the cold air, the particular way he breathed when he was tired, the smell of leather and horse and wood smoke, that was simply what the world smelled like out here, but that she had somehow become aware of as specifically his. "Tell me something about yourself that I do not know," she said, because the silence had been long and comfortable and she wanted to hear his voice. He thought about this for a moment. "I can read," he said, "better than most people expect. My mother taught me. She had a box of books she had brought from Tennessee and she made sure all her children could read before they could do much else." "What kind of books?" "Everything she could get. Novels, history, some poetry that I have mostly forgotten. A Bible she knew by heart." He paused. "I have not had a book in about a year." "I have one," she said. "In my saddlebag. It was my father's. It is a collection of essays. I have read it so many times I have parts of it memorized." "Could I borrow it?" he asked, and there was a genuine eagerness in the question that she found unexpectedly moving. "You can," she said. "When we reach Caldwell and there is time, you can have it as long as you want." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something open and warm and slightly surprised at itself. "Thank you," he said. "That is a real kindness." "You called my name in front of the whole camp after a stampede," she said. "A book loan seems modest by comparison." He smiled. It was the full smile, the one that seemed to surprise him, and it surprised her too because she had not been trying to produce it, and she was pleased that she had. They sat together in the cold and the smell of rain and the sounds of the camp settling around them, and did not move apart even though there might have been slightly more room if they had. On the 7th week, they struck trouble of a different kind. 3 men rode into camp from the south, hard-ridden horses and weather-beaten faces, and the specific look of men who had been following the herd for a while. They said they were drovers from a Texas outfit that had sold cattle to the same buyer, and they were traveling north on the same route. Virgil Tuck was polite to them because hospitality on the trail was a genuine code, even to strangers, and he offered them coffee and asked their names, which they gave, and said their outfit was a few days behind. Delia did not like them. She could not have said exactly why, in terms that Virgil Tuck would have found conclusive, but she had a specific unease about these 3 men that she watched from across the camp with careful eyes. The way they looked at the herd count. The way they asked questions that sounded like casual conversation but were gathering information, numbers and routes and river crossing points. The way they looked at her in a way that had nothing in it she recognized as decency. She said to Clark that evening quietly, "Those men are not drovers." "No," he said equally quietly, "they are not. You see it too." "I see it. I talked to Virgil." His jaw tightened slightly. "He is aware." He sent them off to make camp separately after coffee, and he told Pete and 2 of the other men to keep watch on the south perimeter tonight. "Good," she said. "I would feel better with you on watch too." "I am on watch," he said. "I told Virgil the same thing you are telling me and he agreed." He looked at her. "You should sleep if you can. You have the early morning shift." "I will not sleep much," she said honestly. "Neither will I," he said. The 3 men were gone in the morning, ridden off in the night, and with them 3 of the beeves from the south edge of the herd. It was not a catastrophic number, but it was a violation, and it left Virgil Tuck with a hard-set jaw and a 2-day period of heightened watch that wore on everyone's nerves and sleep. The men were never caught. Too much of a head start in too much country, and the loss was absorbed the way the drive absorbed all losses, by continuing. But the incident had done something to the dynamic of the camp. The men were tighter with each other after it, the shared experience of violation creating a solidarity that had not been quite there before, and Delia was included in that solidarity in a way that felt different from the careful tolerance of the early weeks. She had been watching the south perimeter. She had spotted the problem before it was named. Dix Colby was the only man who did not seem to notice this or did not care, but even Dix Colby was quieter after that night, his campaign of small antagonisms reduced to something more intermittent and less energetic. The trail was wearing everyone down. Even the strongest men on the drive had the particular drawn quality of people who had been working hard for a long time with inadequate sleep, and the same food every day, and the same horizon every day, and the same demands every day. And the end of the drive was now something they talked about at the fire with the reverence of the truly devoted. The railhead, and the final sail and the pay, and the possibility of a real meal and a real bed and a bath. Delia thought about the end of the drive differently than the men did in one specific way. The men had places to go after. Some of them had families. Some had other outfits lined up. Some would take their pay to a saloon and spend most of it in a week and then find the next drive. Delia had not decided what came after. She had enough saved now, combining what she had brought with what she was earning, to give herself some choices. She did not know yet what those choices looked like. She knew, increasingly, that one of the things she was thinking about when she thought about the end of the drive was Clark Hawkins and what happened to him at the end of it. She had not allowed herself to think too directly about this. She was a practical woman, and she had learned to be careful with things she wanted, because wanting something too much before you knew it was possible was a particular kind of pain she had experienced before and did not relish. But the accumulation of 7 weeks of days alongside this man had produced something that she could no longer pretend was simply professional respect or camaraderie, something warmer and more specific and more permanent in its feeling. She knew he felt something too. She was not a fool and she was not inexperienced, and the way he looked at her in unguarded moments, the way he found reasons to work near her, the way he said her name with a particular quality that was different from how he said anyone else's name, none of this was ambiguous, but neither of them had said anything direct. The drive was not the place, or perhaps they were both people who moved carefully toward things that mattered. She thought about it in the nights, in her bedroll at the edge of camp, looking at the Kansas stars, which were extraordinary in number and brightness in a way that city people would not believe, and she thought this is what it is like to be falling in love on a cattle drive, which is ridiculous and probably inevitable. The last week of the drive was the hardest, which she had been told to expect, but which proved harder than the telling. The cattle were trail-worn and difficult to push, wanting to stop and graze, wanting to turn back toward the south where they had been, and the men were too tired to be fully patient, which made the cattle more difficult, which made the men more tired. Senor Ramirez had run low on coffee, which was its own kind of catastrophe, and the last beans were grim and ancient and nearly inedible. On the second to last day, Delia's horse went lame. Reed put a front foot wrong in a hole concealed by long grass and came up with a sprain that was not severe but was definitive. He could not work on it. She pulled the saddle and led him to the chuck wagon and put him on a lead behind it, and she went to Virgil Tuck with the practical problem of needing a horse for the final push. And Virgil, who was a man of limited imagination, said he was sorry but every spare horse was already carrying something. Clark Hawkins heard this conversation and walked over. "She can ride Soldier," he said. "I will pull from the remuda." Virgil looked between them. "Your horse," he said to Clark, in a tone that made it clear he thought this was a significant offer. "Soldier will work for her," Clark said. "He is steady enough. I can manage from the remuda string." Delia began to say that she could manage from the remuda string herself, and Clark looked at her with a very slight expression that communicated, without words, that Soldier was the better horse for this situation, and she knew it and they both knew it, and this was a practical decision, not a chivalric one. She recognized the argument because it was accurate. "Thank you," she said. "You saved 20 cattle from a bad death in a stampede," he said. "A horse loan is modest by comparison." She heard her own words come back to her, and she felt something warm move through her chest that she chose not to examine too closely right at that moment. Soldier was indeed steady enough. He was a large horse with a broad, honest face and the kind of temperament that knows its job, and he accepted Delia's direction with an equanimity that she found deeply charming. She worked the last day and a half of the drive on Soldier, and the horse gave her everything she asked for, and she thought, not for the first time, that you can know a great deal about a person by the horse they have chosen to keep. The railhead at Caldwell appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon of the 8th week, the cluster of low buildings and pens visible from 2 miles out, and the sound that went through the drive was not quite a cheer, but was something in that territory, a collective exhalation of relief and accomplishment. The cattle seemed to sense the end of the drive too, the specific quality of their movement changing slightly, the push less difficult in those last miles. They brought the herd into the pens at Caldwell as the sun was getting long and golden in the west. 500 head of Texas Longhorns minus 11 lost to the storm, and 3 stolen by those men from the south. 486 animals delivered, which Virgil Tuck called a very good number with something in his voice that was as close as Virgil Tuck got to enthusiasm. The buyers came out from town and the accounting began, and the men were told they would have their pay by morning and tonight they could rest, or they could go into town and celebrate at their own discretion, as long as they were sober enough to ride out tomorrow if they chose. Senor Ramires was making the best supper he had made in 8 weeks, having restocked in town that afternoon, and there was real coffee and real bread, and something that was not beans. The camp that evening was a different animal from the camps of the trail. Men who had been too tired to laugh were laughing. Pete Sorrows was telling a story about a steer he had chased that somehow involved a beaver dam, and the story kept getting bigger in the telling. Even some of the veterans who never showed much were letting themselves feel good about finishing a hard drive in good shape. Delia sat at the fire and let herself feel it too. The particular satisfaction of having done a hard thing for the full length of it, having started something and finished it, having not been broken by any of it, was one of the best feelings she knew. She had blisters and saddle sores, and her back ached in a way she knew would take several days to resolve, and she was content in her bones. And then Clark Hawkins, who was standing on the other side of the fire with his coffee cup, speaking to 2 of the other hands, stopped in the middle of what he was saying and raised his voice. "Gentlemen," he said, and the word had the weight of intentionality, and people looked. "I want to say something before we all go our separate ways." The camp quieted the way it had quieted before. Senor Ramires lowered his ladle. Dix Colby, across the fire, had an expression like he was bracing for something. Pete Sorrows looked attentively at Clark. "This was a hard drive," Clark said. "We started with 500 head and we delivered 486. We had a stampede that could have been much worse. We had a theft that could have been much worse. We had bad weather and bad ground and a man with a broken arm. By any honest measure, this was a successful drive, and every man here worked hard for that." He paused. "But I am going to tell you what I saw on this drive, because I think it needs to be said clearly in a full camp at the end of it." He looked across the fire and he found her eyes and he held them. "Delia Lockhart outworked every man on this drive," he said. "Every single one of us. She pulled drag for a week without complaint. She turned 20 head in a midnight stampede by herself in the dark and the rain. She spotted trouble before the rest of us named it. She worked this final push on an unfamiliar horse because her own horse was lame, and she worked it as hard as anyone. She did all of this knowing that half of you were watching to see her fail, and some of you were hoping for it." He said it loud. He said it loud enough for the whole camp to hear, loud enough that it could not be walked back or softened or pretended not to have been said. He said it in the carrying voice of a man who had decided something true needed to be put into the world and was putting it there with both hands. "Delia Lockhart," he said, her full name, loud and clear in the night air. "That is the name of the best hand on this drive. I want that known." The fire crackled. The night insects sang in the grass beyond the camp. Pete Sorrows started clapping, which was a young man's response and an honest one. 2 of the veterans nodded, the kind of nod that is a statement of agreement from men who do not make many statements. Senor Ramires made a small, approving sound and went back to his cooking. Virgil Tuck looked at Clark Hawkins for a long moment and then looked at Delia and said, in his flat voice, "He is not wrong." Dix Colby was the only man in the camp who said nothing and looked at nothing. Delia sat very still. She felt the words settle over her like warmth, like sunlight on cold skin, the specific quality of being seen truly and spoken of truly in a place where you have worked hard to be seen at all. She had not expected to feel this moved by it. She had thought she had made peace with not needing acknowledgement, and perhaps she had made peace with not expecting it, but that was not the same as not needing it at all, and she discovered in this moment that she had needed this more than she had known. She looked at Clark Hawkins across the fire, and he was looking at her, and there was nothing complicated in his expression, just the simple honesty of a man who had said what he believed and was glad to have said it. She stood up. She crossed the fire to him. The camp watched because there was nothing subtle about what she was doing, but she did not care about the watching. She stood in front of him and she said, quietly enough that it was just between them even though they were in full view of everyone, "Why did you do that? The real reason. Not the right thing to do. The real reason." He looked at her for a moment with that steady quality of his. Then he said, equally quietly, "Because you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time, and because I would like the chance to tell you that when we are not surrounded by 14 other people and 400 cattle." Delia felt something that she recognized as the moment before you step off a high place into water, that moment of commitment before the thing actually happens, and she said, "The drive is over." "It is," he said. "Then we are not surrounded by 400 cattle anymore," she said. He smiled, the full surprised smile, and he said, "No, I suppose we are not." The next morning, in the pale Caldwell morning with the smell of coffee and the sounds of a cattle town waking up, Clark Hawkins asked Virgil Tuck a practical question about travel routes east, which was purely logistical, and then he went and found Delia, who was at the stable checking Reed's injured leg, which was improving but still needed careful management. He stood in the doorway of the stable in the morning light and he said, "What are your plans?" She straightened from Reed's leg. "I have not entirely decided," she said. "I have enough saved to give myself some time to decide. I was thinking about staying in Caldwell for a few days before I make any choices." She looked at him. "You?" "I have not entirely decided either," he said, in a tone that communicated clearly that his decision had something to do with hers. She looked at him in the morning stable light with the horses warm around them and the smell of hay and the town waking outside, and she said, "Then maybe we could be undecided together for a few days." "I would like that," he said. Those few days in Caldwell were unlike anything that had come before them, which was the particular quality of time that exists in the space after one thing has ended and before the next thing has defined itself. They walked in the town in the evenings, which was a proper town with a main street and a general store and a hotel and several establishments of varying respectability, and a church that Delia noted as evidence of civilization working at the frontier. They ate real food in a proper dining room and drank coffee that was not Senor Ramirez's particular brand of brutal, and they talked. They talked for hours, in the way that people talk when they have been in close proximity for weeks, and the structure that held them apart has suddenly been removed, and there is no longer any reason not to say everything. He told her about his family in Colorado, his mother who had died 4 years past, and his father who had remarried, and his brother who had died of a fever on a ranch in New Mexico territory, which was the closed door she had respected weeks ago, and which he now opened for her with a deliberateness that told her he was trusting her with it. She told him about her father, about growing up on that small spread south of Abilene, about what it had been like to be the only child of a man who treated her as capable of everything he was capable of, about the specific grief of watching the bank take the place her father had built with his hands over 20 years. They talked about what they wanted. Not in the abstract philosophical way, but in the specific practical way of people who are building towards something and are beginning to understand what it is. "I want land," Delia said one evening. They were sitting outside the hotel on a bench in the evening air, and the town was doing its evening things around them, horses and boots and the sound of piano from somewhere down the street. Not someone else's land. My own. I want to run cattle on my own land and do the work the way my father taught me and not have to prove myself to anyone except the cattle and the land. That is a good want, he said. It will take time, she said. I do not have enough yet, but I am heading there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if you were not heading there alone?" She turned and looked at him. The evening light was very golden, and it caught the angle of his face and the scar on his jaw and the dark curl of his hair at the collar, and she thought she had been trying not to think about how she felt about looking at him, and now she stopped trying. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I am asking," he said, slowly and with great care, like a man who has thought about words and chosen these specifically, "if you would consider the possibility of a partnership, of the land and work kind, and of the other kind as well." "The other kind," she said. "I have some money saved," he said. "Together we would have more, not enough yet, but more. And I think with two people who work the way we both work, the time to enough would be shorter than either of us alone." He stopped and then started again, with less calculation and more honesty. "I know that is a practical argument, and this is not purely a practical conversation. I am trying to say that I want to build something, and I want to build it with you. And I think we would be very good at that together. And I also think that I am considerably happier when I am near you than when I am not. And I have been near you for 8 weeks, and I do not want to stop." Delia sat with all of this for a long moment. The piano from down the street was playing something she half recognized. A horse clipped past on the street. The evening was warm, and the sky above the town was turning the particular deep blue that comes just before the stars appear. "I need you to be clear," she said. "What exactly are you proposing?" He looked at her directly. "I am proposing that we get married," he said, "and that we find land and build something together, and that I would consider that the best possible thing I could do with the rest of my life." She sat with that. She sat with it fully, turning it over, looking at it from all sides with the same careful, honest eye she brought to everything. She thought about what she knew of him. 8 weeks of knowing a person in the specific intense way you know someone when you work alongside them in hard conditions, which is a kind of knowing that strips away pretense faster than years of social acquaintance. She thought about the night of the stampede and the name said loud across the fire. She thought about the stable doorway in the morning light and the borrowed horse and the book loan and the conversations in the dark and the honest, steady look of him. She thought about her father, who had told her that the cattle do not care and the land does not care, and who had also told her once that the right person was someone who made you feel like the world was slightly more navigable than it had seemed before, and who that person had nothing to do with convention and everything to do with truth. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me," he said, without a flicker of hesitation. "The land is in both our names," she said, "from the start. Not mine or yours, ours." "Yes," he said immediately. "I work the ranch the same way I have always worked, the same way I worked this drive. I'm not going to become a woman who stays in the house and watches out a window." "I would not want you to," he said. "That would be losing half of what I am proposing to build. If we have children," she said, "we raise them the way my father raised me. We do not tell them what they can or cannot do based on what they are. That is how I intend to raise any child of mine," he said. She looked at him one more time. Then she said, "All right, Clark Hawkins, I will marry you." The sound that came out of him was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath, but something that contained both, and his whole face changed in a way she had not seen before, something released in it. Some tension she had not known he was carrying gone. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her with any intention behind it, and she let him hold it, and she looked down at their hands and then at his face. "I should have made this argument weeks ago," he said. "No," she said. "Weeks ago we were on a cattle drive. You said what needed to be said then. This is right now." He raised her hand and held it for a moment, and then, with the particular deliberateness of a man doing something he has been thinking about for some time, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was not a long kiss, but it was a real one, warm and quiet and unambiguous, and when it ended they sat in the Caldwell evening with their hands still together and the stars beginning to appear and the town making its evening sounds around them. "I should tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I have wanted to do that since the second week of the drive." She laughed, which was not something she did frequently and which surprised her slightly when she did, and he smiled the full surprised smile at the sound of it, and they sat together in the gathering dark like two people who have just decided something important and are letting it settle into being real. They were married in Caldwell 3 days later, in the church she had noticed as evidence of civilization, in a ceremony conducted by a minister who had been on the frontier long enough to conduct marriages for cowboys and ranchers, and everyone in between with equal equanimity. There were no family members present because there were no family members within riding distance. Senor Ramires, who had stayed in Caldwell for a few days before heading back south, stood with them as a witness and cooked them a meal afterward that was the best meal Delia had eaten in months, and toasted them with something from a flask he produced from somewhere with the air of a man who had been saving it for exactly this occasion. Pete Sorrows had heard about the wedding somehow, in the way news travels in a small town, and appeared at the church door looking awkward and young and genuinely pleased. Virgil Tuck sent word through Pete that he wished them well, and that if they ever wanted to hire on for a drive, they had places in his outfit, which from Virgil Tuck was approximately the equivalent of a speech of praise from a lesser man. Nobody heard from Dix Colby. They did not expect to. In the weeks that followed, Delia and Clark stayed in Caldwell long enough to form a plan. They pooled what they had saved, which was not a grand sum but was a real one, and they made inquiries about land. The country south of Caldwell and north of the Cherokee Strip was being opened to settlement in ways that made land accessible if you were willing to work for it. And there were homestead opportunities in the Kansas grassland that were not easy but were real. They found their land in a day's ride south of Caldwell, a section of ground that was not the most dramatic landscape in Kansas, but had the things that mattered: grass, water from a creek that ran clear even in dry months, shelter from the prevailing winds by a rise to the north, and ground that had not yet been broken and looked at them with the specific invitation of land that wants to be worked. Delia walked it and felt in her feet the same thing her father had described feeling when he found his place, which was recognition, the sense of having arrived somewhere you were always meant to arrive. The first year was brutally hard. They built a small house together, Clark doing the heavy structural work and Delia doing everything else with equal energy, and the house was simple and solid and smelled of fresh lumber and the grassland air. They bought a small starter herd, 12 cows and a good bull, with money that left them very little margin for error. Clark took work with neighboring outfits during the busy seasons to bring in cash while Delia managed the home ranch. And she was good at managing it, not in the domestic sense alone but in the full operational sense: the fences, the cattle, the hay cutting, the negotiating with the feed supplier in Caldwell, who initially did not take her seriously, and who learned to take her very seriously after she demonstrated a thorough knowledge of market prices and an absolute willingness to take her business elsewhere. They grew the herd slowly and carefully, making good decisions about breeding and culling that Delia drove largely based on her years of watching her father and her own close observation of cattle. By the end of the second year, they had 30 head and a reliable market contact at the railhead. By the end of the third year, they had 60 head and had put a second room on the house and a proper barn in place of the first rough shelter. It was in the spring of the third year that their first child was born. Delia had continued working the ranch through most of the pregnancy, which was a subject she and Clark had a single significant conversation about in the 4th month when he suggested she might take things easier. She had listened to his concern, which was real and came from love, and she had explained with patient clarity that she was not sick, she was pregnant, and that these were different conditions requiring different management, and that she had been around enough ranch animals to know that working bodies do better than idle ones, and that she would be sensible without being fragile. He had accepted this and not raised it again, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. The birth was handled by a midwife from the nearest settlement, a competent, weathered woman named Mrs. Caldecott, who had delivered more frontier babies than she could count, and who was brisk and unflappable, and exactly what the situation required. Clark was outside the house during the actual delivery, which was the custom of the time, and Delia was aware of him pacing and could hear his boots on the porch boards, which she found both amusing and deeply touching. The baby was a boy, healthy and large, and loud about his opinions from the first moment, with a full head of dark hair and his father's jaw. Clark came into the room when Mrs. Caldecott called him, and the look on his face when he first held his son was something Delia would carry for the rest of her life, something that had no adequate word for it, a man encountering the largest feeling of his life and not trying to be anything other than exactly as moved as he was. "Henry," Delia said. "I would like to call him Henry." Clark looked at her over the baby's head, and his eyes were bright, and he said, "Henry Lockhart Hawkins." "Yes," she said. "Your father would have liked that," he said. "He would have liked this whole thing," she said, meaning the ranch and the work and Clark and all of it. "He would have liked you." "That means something," Clark said, with the particular simplicity of a man who understood what it meant for her to say it. Henry proved to be a child of enormous energy and excellent health, and a temperament that seemed to have inherited both his mother's determination and his father's steady quality, which made him at once unstoppable and unflappable in ways that kept his parents both delighted and occasionally exasperated. He was on horses as soon as he could sit, which was early, because the horses on their ranch were good horses, with the kind of calm temperament that Delia had always insisted on as a non-negotiable. He showed a particular aptitude for reading, which Clark taught him with the same patient commitment his own mother had brought to it, sitting with the boy in the evenings under the lamp with a book balanced between them. 2 years after Henry, they had a second child, a girl they named Ruth, who arrived in the world with her mother's gray-green eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw that was entirely her own. Ruth was quieter than Henry in her early years, a watcher, a child who sat at the edge of things and took everything in before she committed to a position, and when she committed to a position, she committed absolutely. Both children grew up on the ranch and knew from their earliest understanding that the ranch was a thing that required everyone's contribution, and that neither gender nor age made some contributions more valuable than others. By the time Henry was 5 and Ruth was 3, the Hawkins ranch had grown to 120 head of cattle, a managed horse herd of 12, a reliable relationship with a buyer in Caldwell, and a reputation in the local ranching community for producing well-bred, carefully managed cattle that delivered consistently good results. Delia had built that reputation the same way she had built everything else in her life, by working harder and smarter and more honestly than was strictly necessary, because she had never known any other approach. There were still people who expressed surprise that a woman ran the cattle operation with the authority she did, and there were still occasional buyers who arrived at the ranch expecting to negotiate with Clark and had to be redirected. She had developed a very efficient method of redirecting them, which involved demonstrating within the first few minutes of conversation a knowledge of market prices, breeding records, and cattle quality that made the question of who she was moot in the face of clear expertise. Most men, confronted with genuine knowledge delivered without apology, found it easier to simply conduct the business than to argue with the person delivering it. Clark had told her once in the 3rd year that watching her manage a negotiation was one of the most entertaining things he had witnessed, and she had told him that she was not performing for his entertainment, and he had said he knew that but found it entertaining regardless, and she had laughed and told him he was a particular kind of person, and he had said he hoped so. Their marriage was not a simple thing in the sense of being uncomplicated, because they were both people with strong opinions and clear ideas, and there were arguments, real ones about real things, about the direction of the ranch operation, about money decisions, about how to handle a particular difficult situation with a neighboring rancher who claimed their fence line was wrong. They argued the way people who respect each other argue, directly and with genuine engagement, and they resolved things the same way, by being willing to be wrong when they were wrong, which was a skill that required constant practice, and that both of them took seriously. The thing that never wavered was the fundamental thing, the love that had built itself out of 8 weeks on a cattle trail, and a name said loud across a campfire, and two people who had recognized in each other the specific quality of genuineness that is rarer than most people know. In the mornings when the ranch work started before dawn, Delia would find Clark already at the barn, and he would look up when she came in, and his expression would be what it had always been since Caldwell, warm and direct, and entirely without performance, the look of a man who is genuinely glad to see the person he loves. In the evenings when the children were settled and the work was done, and they sat on the porch they had added to the house in the 4th year, with the grassland dark and the stars enormous, and the sound of the cattle settled in the near pasture, she would sit beside him and feel the specific contentment of a life that was exactly what she had built it to be. There were hard years. A drought in the 6th year that required selling down the herd to a size they could sustain, which set them back financially in ways that took 2 years to recover. A winter illness that moved through the children's settlement school and put both Henry and Ruth to bed for weeks, and kept Delia at their sides with the specific white-knuckled fear of a mother watching her children sick, though both recovered fully. A spring flood that took out a 1/4 mile of fencing and drowned 6 head, and required 3 weeks of brutal repair work. They managed it all the same way they had managed everything together, with the specific efficiency of 2 people who had learned each other's working rhythms, until they complemented each other as naturally as breathing. There was never a crisis that found one of them carrying it alone. When the drought year was hardest and the money was stretched thin, and Delia was privately afraid in a way she had not been afraid since the bank took her father's place, she told Clark, and he sat with her in that fear without trying to fix it or minimize it. And then they made a plan together, and the making of the plan was better than the fear. When Henry was 10 and Ruth was 8, they hired their first hand, a young man named Joseph Webb who was 17 and had grown up on a farm in Missouri and had some cattle experience and was willing to learn the rest. Delia ran the hiring the same way Virgil Tuck had run it years ago, with a practical assessment of what the person could actually do, and an offer of equal pay for equal work with no particular drama about it. Joseph Webb was a good hire, and he stayed 5 years before he went north to try his own hand at homesteading, and they gave him a good reference and a proper send-off, and he wrote to them for years afterward. The cattle operation grew steadily through Henry's childhood into something that was not a great ranch by the standards of the big outfits in Texas, but was solid and real and profitable and theirs. The land they had chosen in that first uncertain day's ride from Caldwell had proved out everything they had seen in it, and they had added to it twice, buying adjacent sections when they became available, until the Hawkins spread ran to 3 sections of good Kansas grassland, with reliable water and fencing that was maintained with the kind of regularity that keeps fence work manageable rather than catastrophic. When Delia was 38 and Clark was 42, they rode the whole perimeter of their land one spring day, the 2 of them alone because the children were old enough to manage the day's work at the ranch without them. They rode slowly and looked at everything with the particular attention of people who have built something and know exactly what it cost and what it is worth, which are 2 different kinds of knowing. The grass was good that year. The spring rains had been sufficient without being punishing, and the cattle were fat and the creek was running and the fence lines were straight. At the far north edge of the property, on the rise that sheltered the ranch from the prevailing north wind, they stopped their horses and looked south over the whole of it, The house and the barn and the outbuildings, and the pastures and the herd moving in the middle distance. "Do you remember," Clark said, "what you said to Virgil Tuck that first morning in the Caldwell stockyards?" "I said a lot of things," she said. "You said the cattle do not care," he said, "about what you are." "They do not," she said. "The land does not either," he said. He was looking at her. She looked back at him. 14 years since the stockyards. 14 years since the cattle drive and the stampede and the name said loud in the dark. 14 years of this land and this work, and this life built out of the specific materials of two people who had recognized each other. "No," she said, "it does not." He reached out from his saddle, and she met him halfway, and they held hands on the rise above their land in the spring morning, two people in their middle years with the good specific tiredness of people who have worked hard for things worth working hard for. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I told the whole camp your name after the stampede," he said, "and I have never once stopped being glad I did. Not once in 14 years. She felt the same warmth she had felt across the camp fire all those years ago, the specific quality of being truly seen by someone who had chosen to see you and kept choosing it. It had not diminished with familiarity. If anything, it had grown more precisely itself over time, the way a tree grows more completely into its own shape with each year. "Clark Hawkins," she said. "Yes. You are the best thing that happened on that drive," she said, "and everything that came after." He brought her hand up and held it the way he had in Caldwell on the evening bench, and she looked at him and at the land below them, and at the life they had built from a cattle trail and a name said loud, and two people willing to be honest about what they wanted. Henry was down there somewhere, probably at the barn, probably doing something decisive and energetic in the way he did everything. Ruth was possibly in the pasture with the horses she had developed a particular interest in managing. Senor Ramiers's old recipe for trail coffee was framed above the kitchen stove because Clark had written it down from memory and Delia had decided it deserved preservation, even if she had better coffee now. Her father's book of essays was on the shelf in the house, the same battered volume she had offered to loan on the drive, now accompanied by a dozen others they had accumulated over the years. Reed, her buckskin horse, had died at a good old age 5 years prior, and she had buried him at the north edge of the property near the rise, which Clark had understood without her explaining it. Soldier Clark's gray had lasted 2 years longer and was buried nearby. The horses they rode now were good horses descended in part from the careful breeding choices they had made over the years, horses that carried their parentage in their calm temperaments and steady working natures. The afternoon was warming, and there was work to be done, the specific endless good work of a ranch that is operating well and needs daily maintenance to keep that way. They would ride back down presently and take up the afternoon's tasks, and the evening would come with the particular quality of evenings on a working ranch, that good bone-deep tired and the satisfaction of things done. But for a moment they sat on the rise and looked at what they had made and let themselves feel the fullness of it. There was nothing unfinished between them. There was nothing owed that had not been paid. There was no part of what they had built that either of them would have traded for an easier version of themselves. The hard years had made them, and the good years had kept them, and the land had received everything they had given it and given back in kind, which is all you can ask of land and all you can ask of love, that it receive what you give it honestly and return it in the same spirit. Delia Lockhart Hawkins sat her horse on the rise above her ranch in the spring Kansas morning, and thought about a line of 14 men ahead of her in a stockyards and the particular stubborn quality that had kept her standing in it. And she thought about a cattle drive and a stampede, and the name said loud, her name, in the dark and the rain and the firelight. And she thought about all the miles between there and here, and what those miles had been made of. They had been made of work, and honesty, and two people willing to say what they meant and mean what they said and build something real from the ground up, which is the only way real things get built. She squeezed Clark's hand and he squeezed back, and they turned their horses south toward the ranch and the afternoon's work and the life that was waiting for them, full and ongoing and entirely their own.